Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Horry. I'm a radiologist at the University of Pennsylvania. My clinical responsibilities are primarily in abdominal imaging, but I also serve as the clinical director for the medical informatics group. So I have responsibilities both on the clinical side and on the informatics side. The photograph on my opening slide is to illustrate one of the things we know about changing systems, and that is it's often much easier to get rid of or change hardware than it is to change software. And that's the key part of my topic today. We'll be talking about data migration. I'm going to touch on some of the economic issues surrounding migrating data, the potential impact on clinical operations, and some of the human resources needs and expectations if you make such a change. Some disclosures and a disclaimer. I do receive royalties from the SPIE for editing a book on PACS systems. My wife is a full-time employee of Siemens Medical Solutions, although she does not work in the radiology systems branch. I also serve as the principal investigator for a phase 3 clinical trial of an ultrasound contrast agent from Bracco Pharmaceuticals. Now the disclaimer. I'll be talking primarily about our experience with migrating data, but the opinions expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the positions or opinions of the University of Pennsylvania Health System, or my colleagues for that matter. I may occasionally use the expression we when I'm talking about an opinion, and that generally refers to some consensus that my colleagues and I had, but in general those are not official positions of the university. Now, an introduction. First of all, these are the kinds of things I'm going to try to touch on today. First, why would you have to migrate data? Secondly, a bit about our experience with having to do this. The third thing is, what is it about migrating data that causes the most difficulty for those trying it? Some recommendations if you have to face migrating data or if you're starting a new digital healthcare information management system project. And by way of preliminaries, most of what I will be discussing relates to migrating data as a result of changing PACS vendors. That's where our experience comes from. So we've done this several times, as I'll describe in just a little while. Now, the amount of data, and that's by volume, is much larger in a PACS than it is for a radiology information system. The problem of changing a radiology information system can be an even larger problem than changing PACS, although the volume of data is smaller. And I'll elaborate a bit more on that as we go along. Now, one of the things that's different about a PACS versus a RIS is the data. PACS communication, at least with various kinds of imaging equipment, uses DICOM, the standard that's been around since about 1992. DICOM objects, and that's what images and other data are called, can be stored and retrieved from most PACS databases. Most radiology information systems for communication use HL7, and HL7 messages, although the HL7 is a standard in and of itself, the messages differ very widely between various radiology information system vendors. So what about migrating RIS data? Why do I think it's more complicated? Well, if you think about it, the number of records will be the same as in the number of records in your PACS. They should be about equal. There should be the same number of patient information records in a radiology information system as there are in the PACS, as they communicate with each other and they share things like work lists and databases. However, the files are much smaller than those in the PACS, as there's no image data. And typical radiology information system databases use SQL, and because SQL databases are ubiquitous, there are quite a few tools available for SQL database migration, as well as a number of companies that can contract to handle such migration. This is a well-known problem in industry when various companies are purchased or lines of products change, databases are often migrated. But you could say, wait a minute, my PACS also uses SQL. And for the database, that's certainly very likely true. However, the database points to image files. And since the tables that define the files are often proprietary, the image data files themselves require a knowledge of the database schema, or the underlying structure of the way the various elements in the database tables relate to each other or are connected to each other. You could also ask, wait a minute, my PACS uses DICOM. Well, most PACS will readily accept DICOM objects from imaging equipment, and they give them back to workstations and other requesters when needed. Vendors often take the DICOM objects apart, and they store the data elements in their own proprietary database structure. But you could ask, I thought my files were DICOM. This is a standard thing that people complain about, is they say, I have a PACS and I thought it has DICOM in it. Well, vendors are not required to store images as DICOM objects. So long as they can accept and return a DICOM object, the standard says nothing about the manner in which the images are stored in a PACS. And the exception is if the system creates DICOM media. That is, images that are stored on a compact disc or various other kinds of media. Those files have to be DICOM objects, and they have to be stored as the standard specifies they are. But that's not true necessarily of the way images are stored within a PACS database. Now, what about the interface problem? I hinted at this earlier. Unlike the DICOM interfaces that exist between imaging equipment and a PACS, the HL7 interfaces between various other systems that communicate with a RIS are typically custom configured. All of those fields that are defined in the HL7 message have to be declared to each other by the different vendors, and often requires that specific kinds of HL7 messages be set up. And there are usually a large number of interfaces to a RIS. In our experience, when we were looking at various interfaces to our radiology information system, we came up with over 100 interfaces, and that's not unusual. Okay, let's start to get to the major subject of this talk, and that is migrating data. And I think the question is, why would you have to do this in the first place? Well, first of all, one of the things that affected us is that a company may leave the business. They may decide that a product line is no longer profitable, or they may switch the emphasis to something else, or they may sell a particular product line off. Or the worst case scenario, of course, is if a company goes out of the business and leaves all the software and clients behind. Another reason would be that the product can no longer support your current work, because your volumes may have increased. The system that you have now may just not scale appropriately for the increase in volume that you have. The product cannot be expanded to meet new needs. An example might be something like adding digital mammography to a practice, and the system has difficulty handling those because of the large size of the files. There could be a corporate decision. A facility might be purchased, or the facility administration may sign exclusive purchase contracts with a vendor or a group of vendors and require you to purchase from that group. Your practice may take over a previous one. In some cases, taking over a practice may mean that you have to change yours rather than the other way around. If another practice has, for example, a more efficient system, you may want to change yours to suit theirs rather than vice versa. You may, at least in some departments, have a new chairman or a new director that has his or her favorite system and wants to change to it because of familiarity or because of a belief that it works better than others. Well, is migrating data as bad as it sounds? I always ask, well, how easy does divorce sound? So the answer is yes, it will be as bad or worse than it sounds. And we've done this 3 times for our PACS vendors, and that's why we have some experience with this. In our ultrasound section, the previous vendor that we had left the business, basically decided no longer to market a particular product line and was not able to sell it to another vendor to use. So we changed vendors when that happened, and then we had to change again the second time because of an inability to meet our expanding needs. Departmental PACS, the health system established a single vendor relationship and required us to change our PACS vendors. And although we wound up doing a lot of due diligence to show that this would be a difficult process, in the end, the administration thought that the advantages would outweigh the disadvantages and required us to make that change. However, after attempting to do this and struggling to get the system to work the way we needed it to, it turned out that it just wasn't possible to do with the system that we had at the time, so we changed back to the original vendor that we had. So if you count that up, we've actually done this about 3.5 times. So, if you have to face changing data, migrating data, how is it that you can decrease the pain? Well, you might ask, what causes the most pain? The capital costs? Well, if you think about it, you wouldn't be changing if there were no money to do so. Secondly, well, you've got all this old hardware. And I always say, well, there's always eBay, which is popular nowadays, and the hoary home for wayward computers. And lest you think I'm joking about that, this is a photograph of a collection I have of space program and militarized computers. That top row there below the orange box in the upper left consists of a militarized PDP-11 system, a computer from an F-111 aircraft, some aircraft gauges, and the next row down is all space shuttle related. The two leftmost boxes are Space Lab computers, 2 different versions, a European-built version and an American-built version, and then the 3 boxes on the right are the Space Shuttle computer suite. The next shelf down with the big black boxes, those are computer systems from a civilian launch vehicle. So if any of you know anybody who's getting rid of such equipment, let me know. So, to get back to the topic, what causes the most pain? Saying goodbye to your present vendor. Come on, you're not a teenager anymore. Grow up. Now, what about accessing the several terabytes or multiple terabytes of data that you have in your present archive with your new system? Now, that's something. This is what I refer to as Vicodin headache number 1. This is the thing that's going to cause most people the biggest headaches. In our experience, migrating data is the number 1 problem when changing systems. And if you know this in advance, if you face changing vendors, it's the one major area to look at as far in advance as possible. Now you might ask, we put DICOM images in there and we can get them back out even if the vendor stores them in a proprietary fashion. Why can't we just read out all the DICOM objects? It can be done, but it's not a fast process. Remember that the proprietary storage of the data elements of a DICOM object, well, the proprietary storage means that the DICOM objects all have to be reassembled from the database before they're exported. So it's not as efficient a process as if the DICOM objects were all stored in their native DICOM form. What about other problems in data migration? Well, is Homer Simpson the same person as Homer J. Simpson? Just because there's a middle initial, does it mean that they're different, or are they the same person? How about Homer Simpson and a slightly different spelling, Homer Simpson without the P, but with different IDs, but the same birth date and address? Is this a result of someone keying in the name differently, making an error on data entry, and because of that, the system creating a new ID? Then you discover that the person actually has the same birth date and same address. This is the kind of thing that we've seen in a number of databases. How about the head CT that actually contains the head, chest, abdomen, and pelvis images? This is a fairly common scenario when dealing with studies done in an emergency setting, that generally the studies are done all at once, and then there's an attempt afterwards to break them into their component examinations. And there are commercial solutions from both the vendors of CT systems as well as third-party vendors that can automatically do some of this for you, and if you've implemented that, at least this will be less of a problem for you. How about studies that went into the database with incorrect order or request numbers? Again, some of this is manually entered data, although that's decreasing with the availability of DICOM modality work list. But still, all it takes is a couple of displaced digits and you now have an order or request number that doesn't match any existing study. How about the studies on read-only memory? that had attributes updated. Well, those attributes are updated in the database, the rewritable part of the system, but not necessarily on the read-only memory, things like write-once optical disk, that aren't changeable. So in order to get the data out correctly, the data has to be read back and then the corrections applied. Again, this is a somewhat time-consuming process. Now, for problems like this in your database, the question it would be, do you have any idea of how many of these kinds of problems there are in your database? Because during a migration process, each of these kinds of problems will either need manual intervention or will need some processing through additional software. There are numerous other examples that I can cite, but all have mismatches of information somewhere in the files.